The explosion shattered the morning quiet like glass against concrete, sending a flock of startled pigeons spiraling into the dust-heavy air above Forward Operating Base Serenity. Dr. Layla Mansouri pressed her back against the concrete barrier, her hands instinctively clutching the worn leather satchel that contained her life's work. Dictionaries in 4 languages, cultural notes scribbled on napkins, and photographs of village elders whose trust she'd spent months earning. "Translator down! Translator down!" The voice crackled through radio static, urgent and raw. But Layla wasn't down. She was very much alive, crouched behind a blast wall, watching smoke rise from what had been the communications tent 30 seconds earlier. The acrid smell of burning electronics mixed with something sweeter, more terrible, cordite and fear. Captain Marcus Webb materialized through the haze like a ghost made solid, his tactical vest dark with sweat and something that might have been blood. His gray eyes found hers across the chaos, and in that moment, Layla saw something she'd never seen in his face before: uncertainty. For 6 months, she'd watched him command operations with the precision of a surgeon, his voice steady over radio channels as he coordinated strikes and extractions. Now his hands shook as he reached for the buckles of his vest. "Ma'am?" His voice was different too, softer somehow, stripped of its military formality. "I need you to put this on." The tactical vest was heavier than she'd imagined, the ceramic plates inside like slabs of responsibility settling across her shoulders. Around them, soldiers moved with practiced urgency, but their movement seemed slower now, more deliberate. Sergeant Rodriguez, the mechanic who'd taught her chess during long evenings, caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture heavy with meaning she didn't yet understand. The base had been her sanctuary for 6 months, ever since she'd arrived with nothing but her linguistics degrees and a stubborn belief that words could build bridges where weapons had only carved trenches. Dr. Layla Mansouri, they called her in the briefing rooms, but the soldiers knew her simply as the Translator, the woman who could make the village elders laugh, who remembered the names of their grandchildren, who brought more intelligence back from market conversations than most patrols gathered in a week. She'd grown up in Detroit, the daughter of Lebanese immigrants who'd fled their homeland carrying only their language and their dreams. Her father had driven a taxi for 30 years, pointing out landmarks in 3 languages to tourists who barely listened. Her mother had cleaned office buildings at night, humming Arabic lullabies that drifted through empty hallways. They'd given Layla something precious, the understanding that language was more than words. It was the architecture of trust, the foundation of understanding, the bridge between worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. The Cambridge PhD in comparative linguistics was her parents' vindication, proof that their sacrifices had meaning. The State Department contract that brought her to Afghanistan had been her own choice, driven by a belief that someone who understood both worlds could help heal the wounds between them. But standing there in Captain Webb's tactical vest, feeling its weight settle around her like a mantle of responsibility she'd never asked for, Layla realized that everything she thought she knew about her role was about to change. "The village elders are coming," Webb said, his voice barely audible above the controlled chaos of the base's emergency response. "Something happened in Zafar, something bad. They're asking specifically for you." Zafar. The name hit her like a physical blow. She'd been there just 3 days ago, sitting cross-legged in Mohammad Hassan's compound, sharing tea and discussing his grandson's plans to study engineering in Kabul. The old man had pressed dried figs into her hands as she left, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he'd said, "You see us, Dr. Layla. Not many do." Now Webb was strapping a sidearm to her waist with movements that seemed both ceremonial and urgent. The weight of it felt foreign against her hip, a reminder that the careful distance she'd maintained between herself and the military operations around her was collapsing. She was no longer just an observer, a facilitator, a voice that helped others communicate. Something had shifted, and the shift felt permanent. The approaching dust cloud on the horizon resolved into 3 vehicles, their engines straining against the desert heat. Layla could see figures moving inside them, shapes she recognized, even at a distance. Abdullah Rahman sat in the front passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his white beard catching the morning light. Behind him, other village leaders she'd come to know over months of careful relationship building. But their body language was wrong. Shoulders rigid with tension, heads turning constantly as if watching for threats that might emerge from any direction. "They won't talk to anyone else," Webb continued, checking the radio clipped to the vest he'd just given her. "Whatever happened in Zafar, they think you're the only one who'll understand, the only one they can trust." Trust. The word carried weight here that it never had in academia. In her previous life, trust was about accurate translations and cultural sensitivity. Here, trust was about life and death, about communities caught between forces they couldn't control, about the difference between survival and destruction. And somehow, without fully understanding how or when, she'd become someone these people trusted with their lives. The vehicles stopped at the main gate, but the village elders didn't get out immediately. Layla watched through the heat shimmer as they sat in apparent conversation, gesturing toward the base with movements that seemed both urgent and reluctant. Finally, Abdullah Rahman emerged from the lead vehicle, his traditional robes dusty from travel. Even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. The man who usually moved with the measured dignity of his 70 years now seemed to carry an invisible burden that aged him decades in the space between the vehicle and the gate. "Dr. Layla," his voice reached her across the compound, carried on desert wind that tasted of dust and uncertainty. "We must speak with you, only you." But as she started toward the gate, Webb's hand closed gently around her arm. "The vest stays on," he said, and there was something in his tone, not quite an order, not quite a request, that made her nod without question. "And you don't go anywhere alone. Not today." The weight of the tactical vest seemed to increase with each step toward the gate, as if it were absorbing the gravity of whatever crisis had driven these men from their village in the vulnerable light of morning. Behind her, she could feel the entire base watching, waiting. Ahead of her, the village elders stood like monuments to a trust that had taken months to build and might be about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. The brass buckles of the vest caught the sunlight as she walked, sending brief flashes across the concrete walls of the compound. Such a small detail, but somehow it felt significant. Light reflecting off metal, creating patterns that lasted only seconds before dissolving back into the relentless brightness of the Afghan morning. Everything felt heightened now, more vivid and more fragile at the same time. As she approached the gate, Abdullah Rahman's eyes fixed on the tactical vest, and she saw something flicker across his weathered features. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if he understood something about the morning's events that she didn't yet comprehend, as if her transformation from translator to something else was not just expected, but necessary. "Dr. Layla," he said again, and this time his voice carried a weight that made the morning air feel thicker, harder to breathe. "There is something you must see in Zafar, something that changes everything." And the other elders nodded in unison, their faces grave with shared knowledge. And Layla realized that whatever had happened 3 days ago in Mohammad Hassan's compound, whatever had driven these men to seek her out specifically, was about to transform not just her role on this base, but her understanding of why she was really here. The tactical vest felt heavier with each breath, as if it were slowly filling with the weight of responsibility she was only beginning to comprehend. Before that morning, Layla's days had followed a rhythm as predictable as prayer calls echoing across the valley. She woke at 0500 to the sound of boots on concrete, the first patrol of the day mustering in the pre-dawn darkness. Her quarters, a converted shipping container with walls thin enough to hear conversations in 3 adjacent units, had become a sanctuary of sorts. Books lined makeshift shelves constructed from ammunition crates, their spines a rainbow of academic texts, poetry collections, and novels in English, Arabic, Farsi, and Pashto. The mirror above her small basin reflected a woman she sometimes didn't recognize. At 31, Layla had always been slender, but 6 months of military rations and desert heat had refined her features to something sharper, more angular. Her dark hair, once professionally styled for university conferences, now lived in practical braids that stayed out of her way during long days in the field. But it was her eyes that had changed most. Brown eyes that had once sparkled with academic enthusiasm now carried depths that spoke of things seen and understood that no textbook had prepared her for. Her morning routine was deliberate, almost meditative. Coffee first. Real coffee, not the military instant that most of the base endured. She'd convinced a supply sergeant to include whole beans in his next order, trading Arabic lessons for the privilege. The coffee ritual connected her to home, to Sunday mornings in her parents' kitchen, where her mother would grind beans while humming old Fairuz songs. The smell alone could transport her across continents and decades, back to a world where the hardest decisions involved choosing between graduate programs, not translating words that might determine whether someone lived or died. After coffee came the review, notes from the previous day's interactions, cultural observations, fragments of conversation that might prove significant later. Her handwriting had evolved too, becoming more economical, more urgent. Where once she'd filled academic journals with lengthy theoretical explorations, now she captured essential insights in brief, practical notations. Hassan's nephew asks about American universities, potential intelligence source or genuine curiosity. Elder Kareem mentions increased Taliban movement through northern passes. Coordinate with intel. The morning briefing was always the same room, the same circle of folding chairs, the same faces, growing more familiar and more distant simultaneously. She was included because she was essential, but she was separate because she was civilian. The soldiers respected her expertise, relied on her insights, but they also protected her from the full weight of their operations. She translated their intentions to the local population, but she was never fully translated into their world. Captain Webb ran these briefings with the efficiency of a man who understood that wasted time cost lives. He spoke in acronyms and grid coordinates, painted the day's missions in broad strokes of risk assessment and strategic objectives. Layla's role was always clearly defined: cultural liaison, linguistic support, intelligence asset. Never combatant, never someone who might need to make life-and-death decisions. Dr. Mansouri will accompany the patrol to Sector 7. Standard protocol. She stays with the vehicles unless specifically requested by local leadership. Standard protocol. She'd grown to hate those words, the way they reduced her to a carefully managed asset, rather than a human being capable of independent judgment. But the real work happened outside those briefings, in the spaces between official interactions where trust was built one conversation at a time. The afternoon patrol to Zafar 3 days earlier had been routine by the standard she'd learned to apply to such things. 20 soldiers, 4 vehicles, a mission to check on reconstruction progress and gauge local sentiment. She'd ridden in the second vehicle, headphones on, reviewing her cultural notes while the landscape rolled past in shades of brown and gold. Zafar itself was a contradiction. Ancient mud brick compounds clustered around a modern well funded by international aid, satellite dishes sprouting from rooftops like technological flowers in a traditional garden. The village existed in multiple centuries simultaneously, and Layla had learned to navigate all of them. With the elders, she spoke formal Pashto, using traditional honorifics and indirect approaches that acknowledged their status and wisdom. With the younger men, her Arabic was more casual, peppered with shared cultural touchstones. With the children, she mixed languages freely, letting communication happen through laughter and gestures as much as words. Mohammad Hassan had been waiting for her that afternoon, as he always was. The village elder moved with the careful dignity of a man whose body had been worn down by decades of hard living, but whose mind remained sharp as a blade. His compound was modest by American standards, but spoke of prosperity within its context. Solid construction, a small garden where his wife grew vegetables, a solar panel that powered a single electric light. They'd sat in his courtyard as the sun moved across the sky, sharing tea and conversation that meandered like a river finding its course. Hassan spoke of his grandson with obvious pride. The boy was 17, brilliant in mathematics, dreaming of studying engineering in Kabul. He worried about the cost, about the safety of sending a young man to the capital, about whether education would lift his grandson up or separate him from his roots. "You understand these things, Dr. Layla," Hassan had said, his weathered hands steady as he poured tea from a metal pot that had clearly seen decades of service. "You live in two worlds. Is it possible to honor both?" The question had struck her more deeply than he'd intended. Living in two worlds, was that what she was doing? Or was she living in neither? Suspended in some liminal space between cultures, between roles, between the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. She'd given him what she hoped was a reassuring answer about cultural bridges and the importance of maintaining connections to home, but the question had lingered with her as the patrol returned to base. That evening, she'd done what she always did when the day's work was finished. She'd written. Not official reports, though those would come later, but personal observations, fragments of poetry, attempts to capture the emotional texture of experiences that defied standard categorization. Her journal had become a lifeline, a way of processing the disconnect between her academic training and the human reality of her work. Today, Hassan asked if it's possible to honor two worlds. I told him yes, but I'm not sure I believe it anymore. Every day I translate not just words, but intentions, hopes, fears. I carry messages between people who see each other as enemies, trying to find the common humanity that exists beneath the uniforms and the rhetoric. But what happens to the translator? Who translates my experience back to something I can understand? The question felt more urgent now. Standing in Captain Webb's tactical vest, with the weight of ceramic plates pressing against her shoulders. The morning's explosion had shattered more than windows and communications equipment. It had shattered the careful distance she'd maintained between herself and the consequences of the work she was doing. The village elders hadn't come to the base looking for a linguistic facilitator. They'd come looking for someone they trusted to understand not just their words, but their world. Someone who could bridge the gap between their crisis and the military response it might require. But trust was a currency she'd never learned to spend wisely. In academic settings, trust was about intellectual honesty, about citing sources accurately and acknowledging the limitations of one's research. Here, trust was about life and death, about communities that had been betrayed by outsiders so many times that choosing to trust at all was an act of profound courage. And somehow, without fully understanding when or how, she'd become someone worthy of that trust. The weight of the tactical vest reminded her of another weight, the responsibility of being trusted with secrets that weren't hers to keep, with fears that weren't hers to resolve, with hopes that weren't hers to fulfill. She thought of Hassan's grandson, 17 years old and dreaming of engineering school, and wondered what kind of world she was helping to build for him. Was she truly bridging cultures, or was she just making it easier for one culture to dominate another? Her reflection was interrupted by movement at the gate. The village elders were preparing to leave their vehicles, their postures suggesting both urgency and reluctance. Whatever they'd come to tell her was something that required courage to speak and wisdom to hear. And she realized that her morning routine of coffee and notes and careful distance from military operations had been preparation for a moment she hadn't seen coming. A moment when she would have to stop being just a translator and become something entirely different. The tactical vest felt like a uniform she'd never chosen to wear, but as she watched Abdullah Rahman approach the gate with slow, deliberate steps, she understood that choosing not to wear it was no longer an option. The morning had changed the rules of her engagement with this place and these people, and she was about to discover what her new role would require of her. The first injustice was silence. Abdullah Rahman had walked 20 meters from the gate before he spoke again, his weathered hands gesturing towards something invisible in the distance. The other elders formed a loose circle around Layla, their presence both protective and confining, like a human wall that shut out the rest of the base while drawing her deeper into whatever crisis had driven them from their village. 3 nights ago, Rahman began, his voice low enough that she had to lean closer to hear. After you left Zafar, men came in trucks. Not Taliban, not government, different men. The second injustice was assumption. Captain Webb appeared at her shoulder with 2 soldiers flanking him, their weapons held in the casual readiness that military personnel called low alert, but which felt anything but low to the civilians around them. Dr. Mansouri, we need to establish some ground rules, Webb said, his commander's voice cutting through Rahman's explanation like a blade through fabric. Any intelligence gathered here goes through proper channels, standard protocol. Rahman's eyes flicked between Webb and Layla, and she saw something close in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of resignation that spoke of too many conversations interrupted, too many promises broken, too many times when the rules had changed without explanation. He stepped back slightly, the physical distance translating into emotional withdrawal, and Layla felt the fragile bridge of trust beginning to crack under the weight of military procedure. "Captain," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice, "perhaps we could hear what they have to say before we decide what channels it needs to go through." The third injustice was the assumption that protocol mattered more than people. Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded and stepped back. The soldiers remained, their presence a reminder that this conversation existed within a framework of military authority, but at least the immediate pressure eased enough for Rahman to continue. "These men," Rahman said, his eyes fixed on Layla's face, "they spoke your language, American English, but they also spoke ours, and they knew things, names, families, who had spoken with your patrols, who had shared tea with Dr. Layla." His voice dropped even lower. They had photographs. The fourth injustice was inevitability. Layla felt her stomach drop as the implications of Rahman's words settled into her consciousness. Someone had been watching, documenting, preparing. The careful relationships she'd built over months of patient work had been cataloged and weaponized by people who understood exactly how to use trust against those who offered it. "What did they want?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be worse than she could prepare for. They wanted Mohammad Hassan's grandson, the boy who dreams of engineering school in Kabul. They said he had been talking to Americans, sharing information about Taliban movements through the northern passes. They said this made him a traitor to his people. The fifth injustice was the corruption of connection. Every conversation Layla had shared with Hassan about his grandson's future, every proud word the old man had spoken about the boy's intelligence and ambition had been twisted into evidence of collaboration. The boy's dreams had become weapons against him, and her encouragement of those dreams had painted a target on his back. "Where is he now?" Webb asked, his tactical mind already moving toward operational implications. But Layla barely heard the question because Rahman was looking at her with an expression that combined grief, fear, and something that might have been accusation. "Gone," Rahman said. "They took him, but first they made the village watch as they—" He paused, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "They made his grandfather watch as they explained why talking to Americans was dangerous.
They used examples. The sixth injustice was the weaponization of care. Layla closed her eyes briefly, trying to process what Rahman was telling her without letting her imagination fill in the brutal details. But her mind wouldn't cooperate. She could see Hassan's compound, could remember the pride in his voice as he spoke of his grandson, could picture the boy's future stretching ahead like a golden path towards something better. And now that future had been shattered because she had been careless with other people's trust. "Dr. Mansouri," Webb said, and his voice carried a gentleness that made the situation feel even worse. But Rahman shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Layla's face. "She needs to understand." They knew about the tea. They knew that Hassan had given her dry
figs when she left. They knew she had asked about the solar panel in his courtyard and that he had explained how it was installed. They knew everything. The seventh injustice was the violation of sanctuary. Someone had been recording their conversations, analyzing their interactions, mapping the network of relationships that Layla had thought of as bridges between cultures. Every moment of genuine human connection had been documented and stored and prepared for use as a weapon against the very people who had extended that connection in trust. "Who were these men?" Webb asked, and now his voice carried the sharp edge of operational urgency. "Did anyone recognize them? Were there identifying markers on their vehicles?" But Rahman wasn't looking at Webb. His attention remained fixed on Layla. And she realized that this wasn't just a briefing about a tactical situation. This was something more personal, more complex. These village elders hadn't come to report intelligence to the American military. They'd come to confront her with the consequences of her work, to make her understand how her bridges between cultures had become paths for predators. The eighth injustice was the demand for impossible choices. "They left a message," Rahman continued, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was carrying, "for Dr. Layla specifically. They said that Americans who truly cared about the Afghan people would stop putting them in danger with their questions and their friendship. They said the boy's situation could be resolved, but it would require understanding." Webb stepped forward, his command presence reasserting itself. "We don't negotiate with kidnappers, Dr. Mansouri. Whatever these people want, whatever they're threatening, we handle it through proper military channels." But Rahman held up a weathered hand, and something in the gesture commanded attention, even from the Delta Force captain. "They're not asking for negotiations," the old man said. "They're asking for Dr. Layla to choose, continue building relationships that put people in danger, or understand that some connections cost more than they are worth." The ninth injustice was the corruption of purpose. Everything Layla had believed about her work, that language could build bridges, that understanding between cultures was possible, that her skills could contribute to something larger than academic achievement, was being systematically dismantled by people who understood exactly how to use her best intentions against the people who she was trying to help. "There's something else," said another elder, Hassan Gul, who had remained silent until now. His voice was rougher than Rahman's, scarred by years of speaking over desert winds. "The boy's father came to see us yesterday. He said his son was being held somewhere near the northern passes, but that wasn't the worst part." Gul paused, looking around the circle of faces as if gauging whether to continue. "He said the kidnappers told him that Dr. Layla would know where to find them, that she had been there before, with the patrols." The 10th injustice was the transformation of knowledge into complicity. Layla's mind raced through her memory of patrol routes, trying to identify locations in the northern passes where she might have been. There had been several reconnaissance missions, routine checks of roads and compounds that might be used by Taliban fighters moving between Pakistan and Afghanistan. She had provided cultural context for those missions, helped soldiers understand local customs that might affect their approach to different areas. And now that knowledge was being used to pull her deeper into a crisis that felt increasingly like a trap. Webb was speaking into his radio, calling for intelligent updates on activity in the northern passes, but Layla too barely focused on his tactical coordination. The weight of the tactical vest seemed to increase with each revelation, as if it were slowly filling with the accumulated pressure of responsibilities she never asked for,
but could no longer avoid. "Captain," she said, interrupting his radio communication, "I need to understand something. These men who took Hassan's grandson, do we have any intelligence about who they might be working for?"
Webb looked at her for a long moment, and she saw calculation in his gray eyes. He was deciding how much to tell her, weighing her need to know against operational security and her civilian status. "There have been reports," he said finally, "of a group that's neither Taliban nor government operating in the border regions. They seem to specialize in targeting people who work with international forces, but we don't have solid intelligence about their leadership or their ultimate objectives." The 11th injustice was the inadequacy of institutional response. Here was a boy whose only crime had been dreaming of an education, kidnapped by people who had weaponized Layla's work against the communities she was trying to serve. And the best the American military could offer was incomplete intelligence and standard operating procedures that treated human lives like tactical problems to be managed rather than moral obligations to be fulfilled. Rahman stepped closer to Layla, close enough that she could see the network of lines around his eyes, each one a story of seasons survived, of hardships endured, of difficult decisions made and lived with. "Dr. Layla," he said, his voice soft but urgent, "Hassan's grandson is not the first. There have been others. Young men who spoke with your patrols, women who served as translators in other districts, elders who helped with reconstruction projects. They disappear, and their families are told it is because they chose to trust Americans." The 12th injustice was the systematic nature of the threat. This wasn't an isolated incident or a criminal opportunity. This was a campaign designed to destroy the human connections that made cooperative efforts possible between American forces and Afghan communities. And she was not only a witness to this campaign, she was unwittingly one of its primary tools. Webb's radio crackled with responses from the intelligence section, but Layla was no longer listening to tactical discussions. She was thinking about Hassan's face as he had poured tea 3 days ago, the careful pride with which he had spoken of his grandson's mathematical abilities, the trust he had placed in her by sharing his hopes for the boy's future. And she was thinking about the tactical vest she now wore, its weight no longer just physical, but moral, a reminder that her role in this place had evolved far beyond translation into something that required her to make choices she had never been trained to make. The 13th injustice was the impossibility of innocence. She could not unknow what she now knew about the consequences of her work. She could not return to the comfortable distance of academic observation or the careful neutrality of professional translation. The morning had stripped away the pretense that she could be helpful without being responsible, that she could build bridges without accepting accountability for who crossed them and what they carried. As the village elders waited for her response, Layla realized that the explosion that morning had destroyed more than communications equipment. It had destroyed her ability to see herself as separate from the conflict around her. The tactical vest Webb had given her was not just protection, it was a uniform, a symbol of the side she had chosen without fully understanding what that choice would cost. And now, Mohammad Hassan's grandson was paying the price for her naivety, held prisoner by people who understood exactly how to use her best intentions as weapons against the very people she had hoped to help. The first revelation came through static-filled radio chatter at 13:47 hours, 43 minutes after the village elders had finished their account. Sergeant Chen's voice crackled through Webb's headset with the mechanical precision of someone reading intelligence reports. "Sir, we've got confirmation on that compound coordinates. Drone surveillance shows multiple heat signatures, at least 2 vehicles, and what appears to be a temporary detention facility." Layla felt her breath catch. The compound Chen was describing sat in a valley she'd visited twice with reconnaissance patrols, a place where abandoned Soviet-era structures dotted the landscape like broken teeth. She remembered commenting to Sergeant Rodriguez about the strategic value of the location. high ground overlooking 3 different smuggling routes, water access from a seasonal stream, and multiple escape routes through mountain passes. Her academic observations had been dutifully recorded in patrol reports, and now those reports were being used to locate Hassan's grandson. The second revelation arrived in the form of Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, the base's intelligence analyst, jogging across the compound with a tablet clutched across her chest. Martinez was 26, a former linguistics major who joined the Army to pay off student loans and discovered she had a gift for pattern recognition that made her invaluable in counterinsurgency operations.
"Captain, Dr. Mansouri," Martinez said, breathing hard from her sprint across the compound. "We need to show you something. The surveillance footage from the Zafar incident, we've been analyzing the vehicles and the personnel involved." The tablet screen showed grainy, black-and-white footage from a drone that had been conducting routine patrol coverage of the area. Layla watched herself sitting in Mohammad Hassan's courtyard 3 days earlier, sharing tea and conversation with the village elder. But the camera angle was wrong. Too low, too close. This wasn't footage from an American drone maintaining standard overhead surveillance. This was footage from something much closer to ground level. "Ma'am," Martinez said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "This footage wasn't captured by our assets. Someone else was watching your meeting with Hassan. Someone with access to sophisticated surveillance equipment and detailed knowledge of our patrol schedules." The third revelation was written in the metadata of the surveillance footage itself. Martinez swiped to the next screen, showing technical details that meant nothing to Layla, but clearly alarmed both Martinez and Webb. "The timestamp on this footage predates our mission by 6 hours, Martinez explained. "Whoever recorded this knew exactly when and where you would be meeting with Hassan. They were in position and waiting." Webb's jaw tightened as the implications settled in. "Inside information," he said, his voice flat with contained anger. "Someone with access to our mission planning fed intelligence to hostile pactors." But the fourth revelation was more personal and more devastating. Martinez swiped to another screen, this one showing a series of photographs that made Layla's stomach drop. Hassan's grandson, the 17-year-old who dreamed of studying engineering in Kabul, standing outside his grandfather's compound. But these weren't surveillance photos. They were portraits, clearly posed, the boy smiling directly at the camera with the unconscious confidence of someone who trusted the person behind the lens. "Dr. Mansouri," Martinez said gently, "these photographs were found on a smartphone recovered from one of the vehicles used in the kidnapping. The phone belonged to Farid Ahmadi, one of the interpreters who works with the 3rd Battalion." The name hit Layla like a physical blow. Farid was someone she'd worked with dozens of times, a soft-spoken man in his 30s who'd helped her navigate cultural nuances in several villages. He was married with 2 young daughters, always carried photographs of his family, and spoke of his hopes for Afghanistan's future with the passion of someone who genuinely believed that cooperation between Americans and Afghans could create something better than what existed before. The 6th revelation came in the form of Webb's radio crackling to life again. "Sir, we have Ahmadi in custody. He's requesting to speak with Dr. Mansouri specifically. Says he has information about the kidnapping that she needs to hear directly." Layla looked at Rahman, who had been watching this technological investigation unfold with the patient attention of someone accustomed to waiting for truth to reveal itself slowly. "You knew," she said, the words more statement than question. "You knew it was someone we worked with." Rahman nodded slowly. "In villages like ours, Dr. Layla, secrets are hard to keep. Farid's family is from the next valley over. His cousin's wife is Hassan's daughter. When Hassan began speaking proudly of his grandson's conversations with the American translator, word traveled. And when Farid began asking questions about which families were closest to the American patrols, Rahman shrugged, a gesture that contained decades of hard-earned wisdom about the complexities of loyalty and survival. The 6th revelation was waiting in the detention facility, a converted shipping container where Farid Ahmadi sat with his hands zip-tied behind his back and his face bearing the hollow expression of someone who had been forced to make impossible choices. When Layla entered the container, wearing the tactical vest that now felt both armor and burden, Farid looked up at her with eyes that held more pain than anger. "Dr. Layla," he said in English first, then switched to Arabic, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt anyone, never wanted to put Hassan's boy in danger."
The seventh revelation unfolded slowly as Farid explained the pressure that had been applied to him over the past 3 months. His wife's family lived in territory controlled by the group that had taken Hassan's grandson, territory where American patrols never ventured, but where influence networks stretched back generations. When his wife's brother had been arrested by Afghan government forces on suspicion of Taliban sympathy, Farid had been approached with an offer: provide information about American patrol activities and local cooperation, and his brother-in-law would be released unharmed. "They said they just wanted to avoid conflict," Farid said, his voice breaking slightly. "They said if they knew when patrols were coming, they could move their people out of the way. No violence, no confrontation, just information." But the eighth revelation was darker. The photographs of Hassan's grandson hadn't been taken for surveillance purposes. They'd been taken as proof of concept, demonstration that the information Farid was providing could be used to identify and target specific individuals who were cooperating with American forces. "They wanted me to take pictures of everyone who met regularly with the patrols," Farid continued, his words tumbling out now as if confession might somehow reduce the weight of what he'd done. "Said it was for protection, to make sure these people weren't put in danger by Taliban who might see them as traitors. I believed them, Dr. Layla. I wanted to believe them." The ninth revelation came from Martinez, who had been analyzing Farid's phone records and communications patterns. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Layla with the formal courtesy that military personnel used when delivering information they wished they didn't have to share, "the communications from Farid's phone show a pattern. Every time you scheduled a village meeting, every time you identified a new contact or developed a relationship with the community leader, that information was transmitted within hours to this network." Layla sank into the metal folding chair that served as the detention facility's only furniture. The weight of the tactical vest seemed insignificant now compared to the crushing realization that every relationship she'd built, every bridge she'd constructed between cultures, had been systematically compromised and weaponized. Her work hadn't been building trust, it had been building target lists. The 10th revelation was delivered by Farid himself, his voice barely above a whisper as he described the final meeting that had led to Hassan's grandson's kidnapping. "They told me the American translator was becoming too effective, that her work was making it harder for them to operate in the villages. They said if I could provide detailed information about one family that trusted her completely, they could demonstrate the cost of that trust in a way that would discourage others." Webb had been standing silently near the door, but now he moved closer to Farid with the controlled intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Who are they, Farid? Names, faces, command structure." But Farid shook his head, and for the first time since entering the container, Layla saw genuine fear in his expression. "I never met the leaders, Captain, only intermediaries, men who spoke multiple languages but gave no names. They communicated through coded messages and dead drops. I was just a source, disposable." The 11th revelation came in the form of understanding that dawned slowly across Webb's features as he processed Farid's description. "Professional operation," he said, speaking more to himself than to the others in the container. "Multilingual operators, sophisticated communication protocols, detailed intelligence about our activities. This isn't local insurgency.
This is something else entirely. Martinez was typing rapidly on her tablet, cross-referencing Fareed's information with existing intelligence databases. "Sir," she said, after several minutes of focused work, "there are indicators that this might be connected to the group we've been tracking in the border regions. But if that's true, then this operation is much larger than we initially assessed." The 12th revelation was written in the pattern of attacks that Martinez's analysis revealed. Over the past 6 months, 17 local nationals who had worked with international forces had disappeared or been killed across 3 different provinces. In each case, the victims had been people who served as cultural bridges, translators, community liaisons, local officials who facilitated cooperation between their communities and international forces. "It's systematic," Martinez said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment that intelligence analysts use to discuss human tragedy in operational terms. "They're trying to destroy trust."
But the 13th revelation was the most devastating because it was delivered by Rahman, who had been listening to this technological investigation with the patience of someone who understood that Americans needed evidence and analysis to accept what experience had already taught him. "Dr. Layla," Rahman said, his weathered voice cutting through the military discussion like a knife through cloth, "Hassan's grandson is not the target. You are." The words hung in the air of the converted shipping container like smoke from an explosion, visible and choking and impossible to ignore. Webb turned to face Rahman directly, his tactical mind already processing the implications of this assessment. "Explain," Webb said, his command voice stripped down to essential function. Rahman looked at Layla, his eyes holding the kind of sadness that came from understanding patterns that others were only beginning to recognize. "Hassan's boy was taken to bring you to a specific place at a specific time. The men who took him left clear signs about where he is being held because they want you to come. They have been watching you, learning about you, understanding how you think and what you value. This has all been preparation." The 14th revelation was the recognition that every choice she'd made since putting on Webb's tactical vest that morning had been anticipated and planned for by people who understood her better than she understood herself. Her decision to listen to the village elders, her insistence on hearing Fareed's full confession, her growing sense of personal responsibility for Hassan's grandson's fate, all of it had been choreographed by adversaries who knew exactly how to manipulate her conscience against her. "It's a trap," Webb said, his voice flat with the certainty of someone stating an obvious tactical fact. "They want to draw you out, probably to capture or kill you as a demonstration that cooperation with American forces leads to death." But Rahman shook his head slowly, his expression suggesting that the American captain was thinking too simply about a complex situation. "Not to capture or kill, Captain, to recruit." The 15th revelation was the most disturbing because it inverted everything Layla thought she understood about her situation. According to Rahman, the group that had taken Hassan's grandson wasn't trying to eliminate her effectiveness as a cultural bridge. They were trying to demonstrate that her bridges led nowhere safe, that her work endangered the very people she was trying to help, and that the only way to truly protect Afghan communities was to work against American interests rather than with them. "They want you to see Hassan's grandson," Rahman continued, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was explaining. "They want you to understand that your choice to build relationships with Afghan families has made those families vulnerable. They want you to feel responsible for his suffering, and then they want to offer you a way to prevent further suffering by providing them with information about American operations." Webb was speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for immediate tactical response planning, but Layla could barely process his coordination efforts. The tactical vest that felt like protection now felt like a costume she'd been manipulated into wearing, a prop in a performance she hadn't realized she was giving. The 16th revelation came from her own memory as she recalled details from her conversations with Hassan that now carried sinister new significance. His questions about American patrol schedules, his interest in which villages received the most reconstruction aid, his careful inquiries about how decisions were made regarding which communities to prioritize for assistance, questions she'd interpreted as the natural curiosity of a community leader now revealed themselves as intelligence gathering, guided by people who knew exactly what information would be valuable. "He was working with them too," she said, the words bitter in her mouth. "Hassan, he was asking me questions that weren't his questions."
But Rahman's expression suggested that even this revelation was more complex than she understood. "Hassan is not a willing participant, Dr. Layla. His grandson was taken partly to punish him for becoming too genuinely fond of you, for beginning to resist the pressure to gather intelligence. The people who took the boy understand that loyalty can be more dangerous than hostility because it is harder to predict and control." The 17th revelation was delivered by Martinez, who had been coordinating with intelligence assets while the others talked. "Ma'am, we're getting reports of unusual activity around the compound where Hassan's grandson is being held. Multiple vehicles arriving, increased personnel, preparation for what looks like a significant operation." Webb turned to Layla with an expression that combined tactical assessment with something that might have been protectiveness. "Dr. Mansouri, I need you to understand that we cannot authorize any operation that treats you as bait, regardless of what these people want or what they're threatening. Standard protocol." "Captain," Rahman interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that commanded attention even from Delta Force officers. "Your standard protocol is what they are counting on. They understand your procedures, your limitations, your rules of engagement. They have planned this operation around your predictability." The 18th revelation was the recognition that every military protocol designed to protect civilian personnel was now working against the possibility of rescuing Hassan's grandson. The rules that prevented Layla from participating in tactical operations also prevented the kind of flexible response that might be necessary to counter an adversary who had planned their operation around those same rules. And as the afternoon light began to slant through the small windows of the detention facility, Layla realized that the morning's explosion had been more than an attack on base infrastructure. It had been the opening move in a campaign designed to force her to choose between her safety and her conscience, between military protocol and human obligation, between the person she had been and the person this crisis was demanding she become. The tactical vest felt heavier with each breath, weighted not just with ceramic plates, but with the accumulated pressure of revelations that had stripped away every comfortable assumption about her role, her work, and her understanding of the conflict she had thought she was helping to resolve. The decision came to Layla at 03:47 hours, in the darkest part of the night, when the base was quietest and the weight of impossible choices felt heaviest. She had been lying on her narrow bunk, still wearing Webb's tactical vest because removing it felt like abandoning the responsibility it represented, when Martinez knocked softly on her container door. "Ma'am, we've got movement at the compound. Thermal imaging shows they're preparing to move the hostage. If we're going to act, it has to be now." But acting within military protocol meant a full tactical assault that would likely result in Hassan's grandson being killed before rescue was possible. The compound's defensive position and the hostage-takers' demonstrated willingness to use violence made a conventional military response nearly impossible without accepting civilian casualties that no one was prepared to authorize. Layla sat up slowly, feeling the ceramic plates of the tactical vest shift against her ribs. In the 6 months she had been at the base, she had never made a decision that could directly result in someone's death. Her role had been advisory, supportive, carefully insulated from the life-and-death consequences of military operations. But the night had stripped away that insulation, leaving her with a choice that no amount of academic training had prepared her to make. "Martinez," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, What would happen if someone approached the compound alone? Someone they wanted to talk to rather than fight?
Martinez's expression shifted from professional briefing mode to something more personal, more concerned. "Ma'am, that would be suicide. These people have demonstrated that they're willing to kill to make their point. Sending you in alone would be giving them exactly what they want." But Webb's voice came from behind Martinez, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. "Actually," he said, stepping into the cramped space of Layla's quarters, "that might be the only option that doesn't get the boy killed." The conversation that followed would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when military protocol collided with human necessity, and protocol lost. Webb explained that conventional rescue operations required tactical advantages they didn't possess: surprise, superior firepower, or numerical superiority. In this case, the hostage-takers held all three advantages, plus the ultimate leverage of a 17-year-old boy whose only crime had been dreaming of engineering school. "But if Dr. Mansouri approaches alone," Webb continued, his tactical mind working through possibilities he clearly didn't like, "she represents something they want more than they want to demonstrate their power through violence. They've invested too much in this operation to throw it away for the satisfaction of killing a hostage." Rahman appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by the conversation, his presence both expected and somehow reassuring. "Dr. Layla," he said, his weathered voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had survived decades of impossible decisions, "Hassan's grandson is alive because they want you to know he can be saved, but only if you make the choice they have been preparing you to make." The choice was simpler and more complex than anything Layla's academic career had prepared her for. She could remain within the safety of military protocol, knowing that doing so would likely result in Hassan's grandson's death and the continuation of a campaign designed to destroy trust between American forces and Afghan communities. Or she could step outside that protocol, accepting personal risk to prevent harm to others while simultaneously walking into a trap designed to compromise everything she believed about her work. But as she looked around the cramped space of her quarters, books in 4 languages, photographs of village families who had trusted her with their stories, cultural notes that documented months of patient relationship building, Layla realized that the choice had already been made. It had been made the moment Webb handed her his tactical vest, the moment she accepted responsibility for the consequences of her work, the moment she understood that translation was not a neutral act, but a form of human bridge building that carried moral obligations. "I'll go," she said, the words emerging with a finality that surprised her, but not as bait, as a negotiator. The preparation took 4 hours and involved more coordination than any conversation Layla had ever participated in. Webb assembled a support team that would position themselves outside the compound's immediate perimeter, close enough to provide assistance if needed, but far enough away to avoid triggering a defensive response from the hostage-takers. Martinez compiled detailed intelligence about the compound's layout, escape routes, and the likely positions of both the hostage and his captors. But the most important preparation came from Rahman, who spent 2 hours helping Layla understand the cultural and psychological dynamics she would encounter. The men who had taken Hassan's grandson were not random criminals or ideological extremists. They were professionals who understood exactly how to use cultural expectations and personal relationships as weapons in a larger campaign. "They will offer you tea," Rahman explained, his voice carrying the patience of someone teaching essential survival skills. "They will speak of their respect for your education and your dedication to helping Afghan people. They will present themselves as fellow bridge builders who have simply recognized that some bridges lead to dangerous places." The dawn departure felt ceremonial, weighted with significance that none of the participants wanted to acknowledge directly. Webb personally checked every piece of equipment Layla carried: radio, GPS locator, emergency medical supplies,
and a sidearm she hoped never to use.
Use. The tactical vest, which had become so familiar she barely noticed its weight anymore, was equipped with additional armor plates and communication equipment that would allow the support team to monitor her location and vital signs. "Dr. Mansouri," Webb said as she prepared to leave the base in a civilian vehicle that would allow her to approach the compound without triggering immediate defensive responses. "You need to understand that once you leave our perimeter, we have very limited ability to protect you. Everything depends on your ability to navigate a conversation that could go wrong in ways we can't predict or control." But Rahman, who had insisted on riding with her to the compound's vicinity, offered a different perspective as they drove through the early morning landscape of brown hills and scattered settlements. "Dr. Layla," he said, his weathered hands steady despite the vehicle's movement over rough terrain, "these people have spent months studying you, learning how you think and what you value. But you have also been studying them, learning about their culture and their methods. Today, you will discover which of you has learned more." The compound appeared exactly as described in the intelligence briefings. Soviet-era construction modified with more recent additions, positioned to control multiple approach routes while offering several escape options. But seeing it in person, Layla was struck by how ordinary it looked, how easily it could be mistaken for one of dozens of similar structures scattered throughout the region. Evil, it seemed, was often disappointingly mundane in its physical manifestations. The first figure to emerge from the compound was a man in his 40s, dressed in traditional robes but carrying himself with the controlled alertness of someone accustomed to violence. He walked toward Layla's vehicle with measured steps, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain with professional thoroughness before focusing on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Dr. Layla Mansouri," he said in accented but fluent English, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that made his words feel like a threat wrapped in politeness. "You honor us with your presence. We have much to discuss." The conversation that followed took place in a bare room inside the compound, furnished only with carpets and cushions arranged in the traditional style that Layla recognized from dozens of village meetings. But the familiarity of the setting made the situation feel more sinister rather than more comfortable, as if her academic knowledge of cultural practices was being weaponized against her. Hassan's grandson sat in one corner of the room, his hands bound, but his eyes alert and defiant in a way that reminded Layla powerfully of his grandfather's stubborn dignity. The boy looked exhausted but unharmed, and when he saw Layla, his expression shifted from fear to something that might have been hope. "Yusuf," she said, using the boy's name to establish personal connection while simultaneously demonstrating to his captors that she saw him as an individual rather than a bargaining chip. "Your grandfather is very worried about you." The man who had greeted her outside, who introduced himself only as Commander Nazir, gestured for Layla to sit on cushions across from where Yusuf was being held. "Your concern for the boy is admirable, Dr. Mansouri. It demonstrates the kind of personal investment that makes you valuable to your American colleagues and dangerous to the communities you serve." What followed was a conversation unlike any Layla had ever experienced. Part negotiation, part interrogation, part philosophical debate about the nature of cultural cooperation and the responsibilities of those who claim to build bridges between hostile communities. Commander Nazir spoke with the educated precision of someone who had clearly spent years studying American military operations and the role that cultural advisors played in those operations. "You believe that understanding between cultures is possible," Nazir said, pouring tea with movements that seemed both ceremonial and threatening.
You believe that language can create connections that transcend political differences, but you have not considered that those connections can be used as weapons against the very people you seek to help.
The argument he presented was sophisticated and deeply personal, challenging not just Layla's professional methodology, but her fundamental beliefs about the value of her work. According to Nazir, cultural advisors like Layla were not neutral facilitators of understanding, but inadvertent tools of cultural domination, people who made military occupation more effective by teaching occupying forces how to exploit local relationships and customs. Every village elder who trusts you, Nazir continued, his voice maintaining its controlled courtesy, becomes a target for those who see cooperation with foreign forces as betrayal. Every young person who shares their dreams with you becomes vulnerable to those who believe that American promises are designed to corrupt traditional values. But as the conversation continued, Layla began to recognize that Nazir's arguments, while sophisticated, were based on the same kind of binary thinking that she had spent months trying to overcome in her work with both military personnel and Afghan communities. He saw cooperation and resistance as mutually exclusive options, trust and suspicion as incompatible responses to foreign presence. "Commander Nazir," she said, finding her voice as the conversation progressed, "you're describing a world where people can only choose between complete isolation and complete submission. But that's not the world Hassan's grandson lives in. He wants to study engineering because he dreams of building things that will help his community. That dream doesn't make him a traitor to his culture. It makes him someone who believes his culture can grow and adapt without losing its essential values." The debate that followed revealed the true purpose of her presence in the compound. Nazir and his associates were not primarily interested in killing her or even in extracting intelligence about American operations. They were interested in demonstrating that her work was fundamentally flawed, that her belief in the possibility of constructive cultural cooperation was naive idealism that endangered the very people she was trying to help. "Release the boy," Layla said finally, when the circular arguments had exhausted themselves and the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the compound's windows. "If you truly believe that cooperation with American forces endangers Afghan communities, then prove your point by showing mercy to someone whose only crime was talking to me about his dreams." Nazir studied her for a long moment, his eyes holding the calculating intelligence of someone evaluating a complex tactical situation. "Dr. Mansouri," he said finally, "we will release Hassan's grandson on one condition. You must choose between returning to your base to continue work that we believe endangers Afghan communities, or remaining here to work with us in protecting those communities from the consequences of foreign military presence." The choice was designed to be impossible: abandon her colleagues and her beliefs to save one life, or maintain her integrity while accepting responsibility for that life being lost. But as Layla looked at Yusuf, bound and exhausted, but still radiating the stubborn hope that reminded her so powerfully of his grandfather, she realized that the choice was actually simpler than Nazir intended. "I choose a third option," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I choose to continue building bridges between communities, but to do so with a better understanding of the responsibilities that work entails. Yusuf comes with me, and we all commit to finding ways to protect the people caught between forces they can't control." The negotiation that followed lasted another 2 hours and involved concessions from all parties that none of them had anticipated when the day began. Nazir agreed to release Yusuf in exchange for Layla's commitment to modify her work methods to better protect the communities she served. Layla agreed to serve as a communication channel between Nazir's group and American military leadership, facilitating discussions about how to minimize civilian harm in ongoing operations. But the most significant outcome was the recognition that the conflict they were all part of was more complex than any of them had fully understood. Nazir's group was not simply anti-American. They were Afghan nationalists who had concluded that military resistance was less effective than cultural preservation in the face of foreign influence.
The sun was setting by the time Layla walked out of the compound with Yusuf, both of them wearing the ceramic plates and communication equipment that Webb's support team had insisted upon. Behind them, Commander Nazir stood in the compound's doorway, watching their departure with an expression that combined skepticism and something that might have been respect. "Dr. Layla," Yusuf said, as they reached the vehicle that would take them back to the base, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, but clear with determination. "My grandfather was right about you. You see people, not just problems." The drive back to the base passed in relative silence, both Layla and Yusuf processing experiences that had challenged their understanding of the conflict they were part of and their roles within it. But as the lights of Forward Operating Base Serenity appeared in the distance, Layla realized that the day had fundamentally changed not just her understanding of her work, but her sense of what that work could become. The tactical vest that had felt like a burden that morning now felt like a tool, not just for protection, but for the more complex and more important work of building trust in a world where trust was both essential and dangerous. She was no longer just a translator. She was something new, something that didn't have a name yet, but felt more authentic than anything she had been before.
The arrangement was unprecedented, controversial, and surprisingly effective. Rather than treating local resistance as a purely military problem to be solved through force, the base had begun experimenting with what Layla called conflict transformation, a process that acknowledged the legitimate grievances on all sides while working to minimize harm to civilian populations caught between opposing forces. The key insight, Layla explained to a visiting delegation of State Department officials, is that cultural advisors can't remain neutral observers. We're part of the dynamic we're trying to understand, and that participation comes with responsibilities that traditional military protocols don't address. Captain Webb, now promoted to major, had initially resisted the new approach with the skepticism of someone trained to think in terms of clear tactical objectives and measurable outcomes. But 6 months of reduced civilian casualties and improved intelligence from local communities had converted him into an advocate for what he called tactical cultural engagement. "Dr. Mansouri has taught us something important," Webb explained to the same State Department delegation. "Building trust isn't a support function for military operations. It's a strategic capability that requires the same level of tactical planning and resource commitment that we apply to conventional military objectives." The tactical vest that Layla had first worn on that chaotic morning had become a symbol of her evolved role. She still wore it during field operations, but now it served not just as protection, but as a reminder of the responsibilities that came with being trusted by people whose survival depended on the quality of her judgment. The ceramic plates and communication equipment had been supplemented with medical supplies, emergency cash in multiple currencies, and translation guides that reflected the complex realities of facilitating communication between groups that had spent decades learning to distrust each other. 1 year later, the wedding took place in Hassan's compound, but the guest list would have been impossible to imagine when Layla first arrived in Afghanistan. Yusuf had returned from his first year at Kabul University to marry the daughter of a village elder from the next valley, and the celebration included American military personnel, Afghan community leaders, and several members of Commander Nazir's organization who had become regular participants in the conflict transformation discussions. Layla sat beside Major Webb at the men's section of the celebration, both of them wearing civilian clothes that felt strange after months of tactical gear and military uniforms. The conversation around them mixed languages freely: Arabic, Pashto, English, and Farsi, flowing together like tributaries of a river that had found its natural course. "Dr. Layla," Commander Nazir said, approaching their table with the measured dignity that characterized all his public appearances, "I have something to tell you that I think you will find interesting." What he told her was that his organization had been contacted by groups in other provinces who were interested in replicating the conflict transformation model that had developed around Forward Operating Base Serenity. The success of the approach, measured in reduced violence, improved civilian security, and more effective counterinsurgency operations, had attracted attention from Afghan communities that had previously seen no alternatives to armed resistance or complete submission to foreign military presence. "You have created something new, Dr. Layla," Nazir continued, his voice carrying the formal respect that had replaced the threatening courtesy of their first meeting. "Not American, not Afghan, but something that serves both communities while belonging completely to neither." But the most significant development was harder to quantify and more important than any tactical success. The relationships that had been built through months of patient work were beginning to generate their own momentum, creating networks of communication and cooperation that extended beyond the immediate vicinity of the base into regions where American military forces had never operated. Village elders who had participated in conflict transformation discussions were sharing their experiences with leaders in other communities. Young people like Yusuf were returning from universities with technical skills and fresh perspectives on how traditional Afghan values could be maintained while embracing beneficial changes. Even members of Nazir's organization were beginning to see roles for themselves that didn't require armed resistance to foreign presence. 2 years later, the congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. felt like another planet compared to the mud brick compounds and desert landscapes where Layla had spent the past 2 years. But the questions from the House Foreign Affairs Committee were surprisingly sophisticated and genuinely interested in understanding rather than merely investigating. "Dr. Mansouri," the committee chair asked, reviewing notes that reflected weeks of preparation, "how do you respond to critics who argue that your approach to cultural advisory work blurs the lines between military operations and civilian humanitarian assistance?" Layla adjusted the microphone before responding, conscious that her answer would be part of a permanent record that might influence policy decisions affecting thousands of people in conflict zones around the world. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice carrying the confidence that came from 2 years of making life-and-death decisions based on cultural analysis. "The lines were already blurred. My work simply acknowledges that reality and tries to navigate it in ways that minimize harm to civilian populations." The testimony she provided over 3 days of hearings would eventually contribute to significant changes in how the Department of Defense approached cultural advisory services in conflict zones. But for Layla, the most important moment came when a committee member asked her to describe the personal cost of working in a role that required constant navigation between competing loyalties and moral obligations. "The hardest part," she said, thinking of Hassan's grandson and Commander Nazir and the countless individuals whose trust she had accepted along with its accompanying responsibilities, "is learning to live with the weight of other people's hope. When someone trusts you with their family's safety, with their community's future, with their own life, that trust becomes part of you in ways that can't be undone. But it's also what makes the work meaningful." 3 years later, the university lecture hall at Georgetown was packed with graduate students, military officers, State Department officials, and representatives from non-governmental organizations who had come to hear Dr. Layla Mansouri deliver the inaugural Holbrook Lecture on Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution. Her appearance had been controversial.
Some critics argued that her methods had been too accommodating to hostile actors, while others contended that her success in Afghanistan was too context-specific to provide useful lessons for other conflicts. But as she stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included several former colleagues from her time at Forward Operating Base Serenity, Layla felt the same sense of responsibility that had guided her work in Afghanistan. These people had come seeking insights that might help them navigate their own complex relationships between cultures, communities, and conflicts. The most important lesson I learned in Afghanistan, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the large auditorium, is that cultural translation is not a neutral technical skill. Every translation is an act of interpretation, and every interpretation reflects choices about which meanings to preserve, which nuances to emphasize, and which audiences to prioritize. The lecture that followed drew on 3 years of experiences that had challenged every assumption she'd brought to her work as a cultural advisor. She spoke about the necessity of acknowledging the political implications of cultural work, about the importance of accepting personal responsibility for the consequences of successful trust building, and about the possibility of creating spaces where competing groups could interact without one dominating the other.
But the most important part of her presentation focused on something that had taken her years to understand: the difference between building bridges and becoming a bridge. When you build a bridge, she explained, you create a structure that allows others to cross between different territories while remaining separate from both sides. But when you become a bridge, you accept that your own identity will be permanently changed by the act of connection. The questions that followed her presentation revealed the hunger that existed among practitioners for frameworks that could help them navigate the ethical complexities of working between cultures in conflict. Military officers asked about operational protocols that could balance tactical effectiveness with cultural sensitivity. Diplomats inquired about negotiation strategies that could acknowledge legitimate grievances on all sides without compromising strategic objectives. Graduate students wondered whether it was possible to prepare academically for work that seemed to require forms of courage and judgment that couldn't be taught in classrooms. To each question, Layla provided answers that drew on specific experiences while acknowledging the limitations of applying lessons learned in one context to entirely different situations. But her underlying message remained consistent. Cultural work in conflict zones required practitioners to accept personal responsibility for the consequences of their success, to remain committed to human dignity even when institutional pressures encouraged dehumanization, and to remember that trust, once given, became a sacred obligation that transcended professional boundaries. 5 years later, the memorial service for Mohammad Hassan took place in the same compound where Layla had first shared tea with a village elder who had taught her so much about the complexities of trust, hope, and human dignity in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Hassan had died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75, surrounded by family members who included his grandson Yusuf, now a successful engineer working on infrastructure projects throughout Afghanistan. Layla had flown back from Washington specifically for the service, wearing the same tactical vest that Major Webb had given her on that explosive morning 5 years earlier. The vest was now more symbol than protection, a reminder of responsibilities accepted and promises kept, of trust given and carefully maintained across years of change and challenge. The gathering that honored Hassan's memory included people whose presence together would have been unthinkable when Layla first arrived in Afghanistan. American military personnel sat beside Afghan community leaders, former insurgents shared memories with government officials, and representatives from multiple ethnic and tribal groups joined in prayers that mixed languages and traditions in ways that reflected the complexity of modern Afghan identity. Hassan understood something that took me years to learn, Layla said when asked to speak at the service. He understood that building trust across cultural boundaries requires accepting permanent responsibility for the people who choose to extend that trust.
He taught me that cultural work is not about translating between fixed identities, but about creating spaces where those identities can evolve and grow while maintaining their essential dignity. Yusuf had grown into a man whose engineering projects reflected the lessons his grandfather had taught about connection and responsibility. His work on rural electrification projects had brought power to dozens of villages using solar technology that honored traditional architectural styles while embracing beneficial innovations. His approach to infrastructure development prioritized community involvement and cultural sensitivity in ways that made his projects both technically successful and socially sustainable. "Dr. Layla," Yusuf said as the memorial service concluded and the gathered crowd began to disperse into the evening light, "my grandfather always said that you were the first American who saw us as people rather than problems. But I think the truth is more complicated than that. I think you were the first person who allowed us to see you as human too." The observation struck Layla with the force of recognition. In her academic training, she had been taught to maintain professional distance, to observe and analyze without becoming personally invested in outcomes. But her work in Afghanistan had taught her that effective cultural work demands engagement and commitment, that success in these environments requires a kind of intellectual and emotional flair that can't be taught in classrooms.
Cultural translation required vulnerability, a willingness to be changed by the process of facilitating change in others. As she prepared to leave Hassan's compound for what might be the last time, Layla carried with her a new understanding of what it meant to serve as a bridge between cultures. It was not about remaining neutral or maintaining professional objectivity. It was about accepting the permanent transformation that came from successful connection, about allowing yourself to become someone new in the process of helping others become themselves more fully. 7 years later, the Conflict Transformation Center that Layla established in partnership with Georgetown University had become a model for cultural advisory training programs throughout the U.S. government and international community. The center's approach emphasized experiential learning, ethical decision-making under pressure, and the personal responsibility that came with successful trust building across cultural boundaries. The students who came to the center included military officers preparing for deployment, diplomats heading to challenging assignments, development workers planning community-based projects, and academic researchers studying the intersection of culture and conflict. But they all shared a common need: understanding how to navigate relationships between cultures without inadvertently causing harm to the communities they were trying to serve. The most dangerous assumption, Layla told each new cohort of students, is that cultural work can be politically neutral. Every act of translation, every relationship you build, every insight you provide to your organization, all of it has political implications that affect real people's lives. Your choice is not whether to have that impact, but whether to accept responsibility for it. The center's curriculum drew heavily on case studies from Layla's work in Afghanistan, but also incorporated lessons from conflict zones around the world where cultural advisors had learned similar lessons about the complexity of building trust in hostile environments. Students studied successful examples of conflict transformation, but they also analyzed failures, situations where cultural misunderstanding, institutional pressure, or personal limitation had led to outcomes that harmed the very people cultural advisors had intended to help. One of the center's most innovative programs paired experienced cultural advisors with recent veterans who had served in advisory roles during their military deployments. The partnerships allowed both groups to process their experiences while contributing to the development of improved training protocols for future cultural advisors. Major Webb, now Colonel Webb, and serving as the Pentagon's senior advisor on cultural engagement strategy, regularly guest lectured at the center about the evolution of military thinking regarding cultural advisory services. His presentations always included the same core message: cultural advisors were not support personnel for military operations, but strategic assets whose work required the same level of institutional commitment and resource allocation that the military applied to conventional tactical capabilities. Dr. Mansouri taught us something that changed how we think about security, Webb explained to a recent group of military officers attending the center's advanced course. She taught us that protecting civilian populations requires understanding them as communities, with their own agency, their own wisdom, and their own solutions to the problems we thought we were there to solve for them. 10 years later. The ceremony at the State Department was smaller than the media attention it generated might have suggested, but the significance of the moment was unmistakable. Dr. Layla Mansouri was receiving the Secretary of State's Award for Excellence in Cultural Diplomacy, recognition for a decade of work that had fundamentally changed how the U.S. government approached cultural advisory services in conflict zones.
But for Layla, standing at the podium in the Benjamin Franklin Room, the most meaningful moment came when she saw familiar faces in the audience. Veterans of the Conflict Transformation Project at Forward Operating Base Serenity, former students from the Georgetown Center, and representatives from Afghan communities who had flown to Washington specifically to attend the ceremony. This award belongs to everyone who taught me that cultural work is not about expertise imposed from outside, Layla said, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had guided her through a decade of navigating complex relationships between cultures and conflicts. It belongs to the village elders who trusted me with their stories, the military personnel who accepted the challenge of changing how they approached their mission, and the former enemies who chose to become partners in building something better than what existed before. The reception that followed the ceremony provided an opportunity for informal conversations that revealed how the lessons learned in Afghanistan had influenced approaches to cultural engagement in other conflict zones. The State Department's cultural advisory services have been expanded and professionalized, incorporating training protocols developed at Layla's Center and operational frameworks based on the conflict transformation model pioneered at Forward Operating Base Serenity. But perhaps more importantly, a generation of cultural advisors have been trained to understand their work as inherently political and personally transformative, rather than technically neutral and professionally distant. These practitioners approached their assignments with a clear understanding that success would require accepting responsibility for the consequences of effective trust building across cultural boundaries. Commander Nazir, now serving as an official liaison between his organization and the Afghan government's Reconciliation Commission, attended the reception as part of an Afghan delegation visiting Washington for talks about post-conflict reconstruction priorities. His presence at a State Department ceremony would have been impossible to imagine a decade earlier. But the transformation of his relationship with American institutions reflected the broader changes that had emerged from years of patient work to create alternatives to purely military approaches to conflict resolution. Dr. Layla, Nazir said during a quiet moment in the reception, 10 years ago, when we first met, I believed that cultural advisors like you were tools of American domination disguised as humanitarian assistance. I was wrong, but not entirely wrong. The work you do can be a tool of domination if practitioners are not careful about accepting responsibility for its political implications. The conversation that followed reflected a decade of evolution in their relationship and their understanding of the challenges facing cultural advisors in conflict zones. Both had learned that effective cultural work required constant vigilance against the tendency to use cultural knowledge as a tool for advancing institutional interests rather than serving human dignity. The test of any cultural advisory program, Nazir concluded, is whether it increases or decreases the agency of the communities it claims to serve. Dr. Layla's approach increased our agency by creating spaces where we could engage as equals, rather than as subjects of study or targets of persuasion. 15 years later. The retirement ceremony at Georgetown University was both celebration and reflection, an opportunity to acknowledge a career that had fundamentally changed how academic institutions, government agencies, and military organizations approached cultural advisory work in conflict zones. Dr. Layla Mansouri's 15 years of teaching, research, and practice produced a generation of cultural advisors who understood their work as inherently transformative for both practitioners and the communities they served.
Yusuf, and built with technical assistance from international development programs that prioritized community ownership and cultural sustainability. The tactical vest that Major Webb had given her 15 years earlier hung in her office as a reminder of the morning when everything changed, when she learned that cultural translation was not a neutral technical skill, but a form of bridge building that required accepting permanent responsibility for the people who chose to cross those bridges. The vest had become a teaching tool, a tangible symbol that helped students understand the weight of responsibility that came with successful cultural advisory work. 15 years ago, Layla said to the gathered crowd, "I thought I was going to Afghanistan to provide linguistic support for military operations. I thought my role would be to translate between fixed cultural categories, to help Americans understand Afghans and help Afghans understand Americans. But I learned something more complex and more important, that effective cultural work requires allowing yourself to be permanently changed by the process of facilitating change in others." The center that Layla had established at Georgetown had trained more than 3,000 cultural advisors who had gone on to serve in conflict zones around the world. These practitioners carried with them a clear understanding that cultural advisory work was not about maintaining professional objectivity, but about accepting personal responsibility for the consequences of successful trust building across cultural boundaries. But perhaps more importantly, the center had contributed to a broader transformation in how institutions approached cultural engagement in conflict zones. Military organizations had moved away from treating cultural advisors as support personnel, toward recognizing them as strategic assets whose work required institutional commitment and resource allocation comparable to conventional tactical capabilities. Diplomatic services had incorporated cultural advisory training into standard preparation for challenging assignments. Development organizations had adopted frameworks that prioritized community agency and cultural sustainability over technical efficiency and measurable outcomes. 20 years later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered to Layla's retirement home in Virginia by an embassy courier who waited patiently while she read its contents. The letter was written in careful English by Yusuf's daughter, who was now a medical student at Kabul University and working on rural health initiatives that combined traditional Afghan healing practices with modern medical technology. "Dr. Layla," the letter began, "my father has told me stories about the American translator who helped save his life and change his grandfather's village. But I am writing to tell you about something he may not have mentioned, how your work 20 years ago continues to influence communities throughout Afghanistan today." What followed was a detailed account of how the conflict transformation model developed at Forward Operating Base Serenity had been adapted and implemented by Afghan communities throughout the country. Village councils had incorporated techniques for facilitating dialogue between competing groups. Regional organizations had adopted frameworks for addressing disputes that acknowledged legitimate grievances on all sides while working toward solutions that preserved community cohesion. The letter included photographs that documented the long-term impact of work that had begun with T. Shared and Hassan's compound 2 decades earlier. Solar-powered schools where children learned in multiple languages. Health clinics staffed by medical professionals trained in both modern techniques and traditional practices. Infrastructure projects designed by engineers who prioritized community involvement and cultural sensitivity over technical efficiency alone. But perhaps most importantly, the center had contributed to a broader transformation in how institutions approached cultural engagement in conflict zones.
Military organizations had moved away from treating cultural advisors as support personnel toward recognizing them as strategic assets whose work required institutional commitment and resource allocation comparable to conventional tactical capabilities.
The letter concluded with an invitation that felt like both an honor and a challenge. Dr. Layla, if your health permits travel, we would be honored to welcome you back to Afghanistan to see how the seeds you helped plant 20 years ago have grown into something larger than any of us imagined possible. As Layla sat in her Virginia garden, reading the letter for the third time, she thought about the tactical vest that had started everything, the weight of ceramic plates that had taught her about the responsibilities that came with accepting other people's trust. She thought about Hassan's grandson, now a grandfather himself, teaching his own grandchildren about the importance of building connections across cultural boundaries. She thought about Commander Nazir, who had become an advocate for peaceful conflict resolution while maintaining his commitment to Afghan cultural autonomy. But mostly she thought about the morning 15 years earlier, when Major Webb had handed her his tactical vest and told her that the village elders would only speak with her. She had not understood then that accepting the vest meant accepting a permanent transformation, a commitment to becoming someone new in the service of helping others become themselves more fully. The weight of that responsibility had never diminished, but it had become familiar, comfortable even. It was the weight of trust carefully earned and diligently maintained, of promises made and promises kept, of bridges built and bridges crossed by people whose courage to trust had made connection possible even in the most hostile circumstances. 20 years later, sitting in a peaceful garden far from the dust and heat of Afghanistan, Dr. Layla Mansouri understood that she had never stopped being a translator. But she had learned that the most important translation was not between languages, but between different ways of being human, different approaches to dignity and hope, and the possibility of building something better than what existed before. The tactical vest hanging in her study would always remind her that cultural work was not neutral, that translation was not just about words, and that accepting responsibility for successful bridge building meant accepting a permanent obligation to the people who chose to trust you with their lives, their hopes, and their belief that understanding between cultures was possible, even in a world that seemed designed to make such understanding impossible. As the afternoon light slanted through her garden, Layla began composing her reply to Yusuf's daughter, accepting the invitation to return to Afghanistan one more time, to see how the work of building bridges had continued, long after the original bridge builders had moved on to other challenges, other communities, other opportunities to translate between cultures in the service of human dignity and hope. The final signature on the letter was simple: Dr. Layla Mansouri, cultural bridge builder, retired but never finished. Subscribe to She Stood First, where silence is never forgotten.